Okay, so welcome to this preview video for Book 21. And again, I teach this book to freshmen in high school, a vast majority of whom haven't been introduced to this kind of book before or to Homer before. So I would say for the first half to two-thirds of the Odyssey, it's pretty heavily scaffolded. And I would say the same for new adult readers. I think in order to feel comfortable reading the book, there's just certain intricacies that if you have a little heads up about in advance, that's really helpful. I think by this point, the scaffolding and the information one needs before reading can decrease a little bit. So you'll notice there's a little bit less of that going on here. So it's probably more going to sound like a series of moments to pay attention to and maybe questions that are raised that are good fodder for discussion, either in class, reading groups, or in whatever context you're reading the Odyssey. So book 21 lands at the end, the sort of the beginning, the end of the rising action of the plot, and we're approaching sort of the climax of the plot of the book. So first of all, we have the second instance of an overt sort of competition. If you remember earlier in the book, Odysseus is on the island with the Phaeacians, and they're really proud of all their athletic prowess. And Odysseus doesn't really play sports. Instead, he's an actual warrior. So there's this sense that there's a sort of set of rules and expectations in sports, whether it's discus or javelin or things like that. Well, here we have a pretty standard trope in ancient literature, which is a competition that leads to winning a wife, which I know doesn't sound that enlightened, but it is 3,000 years ago. And probably the modern analogy would be The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, right? So I remember I'm a New England Patriots football fan, and I remember something that stood out about this first Super Bowl winning team was that in the history of the Super Bowl up until 2002, which is the year this Super Bowl was played in late January of 2002, is that the starting players would be introduced one at a time. So you'd say, starting a quarterback for the New England Patriots, Tom Brady, and he'd run out. Well, this Patriots team set a different tone. They insisted on being introduced as a team. And I think ever since then, every Super Bowl team has done that. So, now with sports, the sort of pregame rules, there's the game rules, and there's post-game rules, right? There's press conferences pretty much at the end of every athletic contest now where you have to talk to reporters. So, and there's obviously rules to every major sport. The same is the case here. And instead of sort of delineating what they are, I would just say pay attention to the interactions, the rules, the setup before the game, before the archery competition. Pay attention to what the nature of the competition is, right? It's essentially just two things, right? It's the stringing of Odysseus's bow, which is in itself hard to do, and then it's shooting an arrow through axe handles. And then the post game is a lot of that is the rest of the poem, I would say. Okay, so if you go to the beginning of book 21, it's page 460 in your Emily Wilson. Just the first handful of lines. With glinting eyes, Athena put a thought into the mind of wise Penelope, the daughter of Icarius, to place the bow and iron axes in the hall of great Odysseus and set the contest which would begin the slaughter. Again, they're not big for suspense here. They're kind of telling you what's up. She went up to her own room, and this is a fascinating line that's worth discussing. Her muscular, firm hand picked up the ivory handle of the key, a hook of bronze. So Penelope is the one that sets up the contest for her own marriage, the winner of which gets to marry her. So the two steps of the contest again are stringing the bow, which isn't automatically done, and then shooting through 12 axe handles. And I'm guessing the people doing this in the Ithacan court aren't standing right next to the axe handles. Now, a passage that I think new readers and even experienced readers will get lost in is on book 21, line 30. And I would just make a bracket down the page from line 30 all the way to the next two pages on to line 113, because here we learn where this bow comes from. Now, this is quintessential epic description. We know that in a variety of ways, we get the history of Luke's lightsaber, which we learned that we know is Anakin's lightsaber. And the Lord of the Rings, which has a lot of epic traits, the history of the ring itself is delineated in a really fascinating way. We know in the Iliad, Hephaestus crafts Achilles' shield, and one of the most brilliant chapters in Homer just describes what's etched on Achilles' shield. So there's always this moment in great literature, particularly older literature, where we get things that are heavily, seriously described at length. And the modern reading brain can easily get frustrated by this, right? Get me to the action faster. I don't want to hear about the history of a bow. I don't want to. Whenever you're tempted to skim a classic text, do the opposite. Go slower, pay closer attention. The history of important objects is as important as the history of important characters. And the history of this bow is funky. So that's worth, I'm not going to go over it now, like find out for yourself, but pay attention to the history of the bow. It goes way back and it's complicated to say the least. My students often, as Odysseus lands in Ithaca in book 13, and as time goes on, my students often get frustrated that the disguises are maintained for so long, that aside from Athena, that for a long time, Telemachus is the only person that knows that Odysseus is the new disguised, the new beggar in town. So here, if you go to line 193, which is the top of page 467, he says who he is, and it's in the middle of the page. He says, I am here now. I've suffered terribly for 20 years, and I've come back to my own land. I see that you two are the only slaves who welcome my arrival. He ends up promising them that he's going to treat them like sons, that the reward for being loyal slaves is that they'll get a sort of promotion in society. If you know Shakespeare's Henry V, the famous Band of Brothers speech, the Battle of Agincourt, in the last section of that play, which is a problematic play in a lot of ways, he says, for he who sheds his blood with me will be my brother, be he never so vile. This will gentle his condition. The word gentle means that if you're a lower class warrior and you fight with me, the king, today, I'll make you a gentleman. It's exactly what Odysseus is doing here. You're technically property today, but if you stay loyal to me, I'll make you my son in a way, right? My stepsons. So it's a very powerful moment. Pay attention to the language used, I would say, all the way to 242. And in the middle paragraph on page 468, I would put a bracket around that, because what he ends up doing is he includes the cowherd and the swineherd in the plans to destroy the suitors. Pay really, really close attention. He gives them a job in handling the women. No nice way of saying it. So I would pay close attention to what that is in those lines. Also pay attention to who is in the contest, who is not in the contest. It's really, really important. Some of the suitors just attempt to string the bow really quickly and they fail. Pay attention to why Antinous doesn't want to involve himself in the contest today specifically. And it has to do with Apollo, so pay close attention to that. Pay close attention to Odysseus's job. Odysseus is still in disguise. And then really read closely, super closely, the last two pages, page 474 and 475 in the Emily Wilson translation. By the way, these graphics, this is totally unrelated, are from a series called Police Squad, which later became the movies The Naked Gun. And I love epic poetry, and I also love really stupid 80s comedies. So I think both, they're not mutually exclusive. One can like both. But pay attention to the foreshadowing here. I think that's really, really important. So I would, again, just before you read, maybe if you're listening to this video, you can write in the margins of 474, 475, foreshadowing, and just pay really close attention. I would say a couple of things. First, as you read this chapter, these last chapters are chock full of dramatic irony. I mean, a ridiculous amount. So again, you can write DI in the margins. And again, it puts the reader in the position of being almost like a Greek god. Like we can kind of see what other people don't know. But don't get a big head. You're not a Greek god. You're just a person, and it's okay. The Greek gods are dysfunctional, and I think we're better off. Moving on. What I would ask my students to do, maybe for homework, is to pick two of the characters below, Odysseus, Penelope, Telemachus, Antinous, and Eumaeus, and make a specific prediction about what you think will happen to him and her in the following books. And I think, again, and you've heard me say this numerous times, making predictions isn't necessarily about being correct in the predictions. It's about sitting in the text, discerning a pattern of what's happening, and projecting forward. It's good reading, regardless of whether you end up being correct or not. So I hope this is helpful in your reading of book 21, and good luck.